everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Your Life Simplified. My name is Jack Giardino, and I'll be the host for this episode. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm really excited for today's conversation with Teresa Carey, owner and executive leadership coach at PerformancePointe. Teresa, thank you for taking the time to join me.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me, Jack.
We're glad to have you on the show. Would you mind just giving a quick background on yourself? How did you get to where you are today? Just allow our listeners a little bit of an insight on who you are and where you came from.
I grew up in a small town of about 2,000 in a rural farming community in North Carolina, and both sets of grandparents were farmers. I bring that up because Jack and I learned a lot about entrepreneurship and running a business, and my brother and I actually ran that farm to put ourselves through undergraduate school. So on the heels of that, I went to the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, got a degree in business, and then started work for the world's second largest document technology company. There I was on a leadership track. I had the luxury of being in sales, professional training and development, and also sales management. So that took me from Charlotte to Chicago and then here to Kansas City. So I knew when I was in professional training and development, I had found something that I was deeply passionate about. And after being in the management role for a couple of years and helping lead a turnaround situation in that office, I decided I was going to pursue a coaching, training, and development career and start my own business. So I went back to graduate school, and 27 years later, here I am in PerformancePointe.
That's great. Quite the interesting background. And I think, we were talking a little bit briefly before the podcast just about coaching and consulting. And I think sometimes, the common misconception is, oh, you left a larger employer to go start your own consulting business. And you kind of politely corrected me on that. Would you mind just kind of clearing up the difference between coaching and consulting?
Absolutely. And you are spot on. Coaching and consulting are frequently confused. Consulting is really working with businesses and leaders and telling them what to do. It's driving or prescribing solutions, whereas coaching is asking the questions and using any number of different coaching models to allow that leader, that individual, to answer a lot of their own questions. Now, occasionally we get into a more directive approach. We'll suggest, and we ask permission to suggest possibilities or options, but that's the difference that we see. So this is different for me today. I'm usually the one asking the questions, Jack.
Well, hopefully I do a good job. I'm sure you would be doing a lot better job than I am. But what does a typical process for leadership coaching look like?
In our world and in our model, we start with assessments. We call it discovery. There are a number of different tools that we use or that can be used. We specifically start with a 360. And the 360 assessment allows input from the individual, from their leader or leaders, their direct reports, and also any peers or team members that they work with frequently. And all of those individuals rate that leader in certain behaviors, which feed to skills and then ultimately define how they show up within the universe of about 8 different competencies that are important for high-performing leaders. Then we also use a tool that is the Strengths Finder, the Gallup Strengths Finder. And so that helps identify the top strengths of leaders. And since we use a strengths-based process as part of our proprietary tool and our leadership development guide that we focus on that marks results, it's important to identify those strengths so that we can make sure that we're focusing on the strengths as we move through the process.
Thanks for the explanation of the tools that you all use, Teresa. Would you mind diving in a little bit deeper on how those tools are used and the specific process for which you implement those tools in a leadership coaching relationship?
Sure, Jack. After we engage the individual in the assessments, then we move into identifying 3 areas that they need to focus on. And then we take those 3 areas and we build them into our proprietary tool that we've developed at PerformancePointe over all these years of working with thousands of leaders. And we're able to track and measure the progress that they make in each of those areas. After we get the plan developed, then we move into meeting with that individual. We have a certain cadence that we know works at the beginning and then also toward the end of the process. And at the midpoint and again at the end, we measure the effectiveness of the progress that we're making.
And I'm sure the progress is always uphill or headed in the right direction. So it's nice to understand the tools you all are using and then the process and how that's really implemented in with the relationship. Diving in a little bit deeper within kind of that coaching segment, right? We have the clarification of consulting versus coaching, but then if we narrow in kind of on that silo of coaching, there's all different types of coaching, right? I hear of career coaching and health coaching and leadership coaching with you. Would you mind just giving a background of all the different types of coaching and then specifically what you're focused on with your firm at PerformancePointe?
Yeah, where we've seen coaching go over the last many years and the diversity of coaching that's offered, I never would have thought possible. But it's actually an advantage to the client because you're working with someone who's in a specific niche. So the more niched a coach is and can be, I think it works to the client's advantage because you can have a higher certainty of that coach's expertise in any given area. So you mentioned some of the main ones. There's like general life coaching, health coaching. There's even divorce coaching in terms of micro specialization. Now, what we do is we engage in leadership and executive coaching. And so that from our vantage point and the way in which we manage it means that we unleash greatness within that leader. And we do that by discovering their strengths and then attaching those strengths to the strategy and the goals and the values of the organization. And we're engaged by the organization versus the individual. Whereas another type of coaching that I might just mention, like career coaching, career transition, or career strategy coaching, or any of the other kinds of coaching I mentioned previously, those would be engaged in by the individual versus an organization.
Okay. That's a great explanation. And you talk about kind of from the leadership coaching being primarily utilized by organizations, are you oftentimes helping those organizations kind of create these leadership coaching programs within their firm? Are you helping them identify that or what's that kind of piece of the environment look like?
Usually an organization will identify key leaders that they would like to participate in coaching. And that might include, a leader who is new in their position. It might be someone who is in a hyper dynamic environment because the organization, the market, and the ecosystem in which they're operating is constantly changing. So that leader needs some coaching assistance. Or today we're seeing more and more accelerated coaching, which is working with the high potentials in the organization, those who are targeted for more aspirational roles, and they want to give them an accelerated or a head start to move into that position. And we work with all three of those. And really, we're just trying to leverage the strengths of those leaders. And we do that by zeroing in on their genius zone. We want to move them from where they are to their best and brightest place. Or some people call it their best and highest use place. I think Mariner refers to it that way. And Marty Bicknell calls it your unique abilities. We happen to refer to it as a leader's genius zone.
And so there's kind of two pieces I want to dive into a little bit deeper with that. The first being that genius zone, just because that word and the way it's phrased just kind of, grabs my attention right away. But then after that, I hope we can get back to how you all are identifying strengths and go into some of that strength conversation. So when we think of the genius zone, how do you identify the genius zone? And then how do you apply that within the organization or individual specifically?
When someone is operating in their genius zone, we look at a few different things, but two standout factors specifically. One is performance. So if someone is on a scale of 1 to 10, performing at an 8, then that's a pretty strong indication that they are excelling at what they're doing. We also look at energy. What kind of energy does that role or that specific project give to an individual? So if they're at about an 8 or higher in energy, then we know that they are operating at a cadence and in a rhythm that's right for their strengths. We also look at potential. That goes back to what I said about hypo earlier. So when organizations are looking at succession, often they'll look at what's the performance of this individual, low, medium, high, and what's the potential of this individual, low, medium, or high.
Hmm.
So if we can get someone at high potential and high performance, then that's another great example of genius zone.
That's great. And so we think about, genius level or genius zone, combined with strengths. How do those two work together? And could you maybe dive into a little bit how you all identify strengths and go about the strength finding process?
Right. We use a number of assessments as part of our discovery process. I'll just highlight a couple in today's conversation that I think really help amplify and identify what the strengths are of an individual. So, one is a 360 feedback assessment. That's when the individual being coached, any of their leaders, their team members or peers, as well as their direct reports, are able to give feedback on about 70 different behaviors
Hmm.
that drive skills and ultimately drive their performance in certain competencies. So all of that anecdotal, that qualitative and quantitative data gives us some pretty pungent clues. All right. And then there's another tool we use I'm wildly fond of. It's called the Clifton Strengths Finder. And you may have heard of it. I know it's
Yes.
used pretty widely, maybe not widely enough, because we know that there's still a lot of focus out there on what people don't do well versus what they do well. And so there's a universe of 34 strengths that we all have. And Dr. Clifton, the lead researcher in his 50 years of research, which is really important, learned that we use about our top 10, about 95% of the time, our top 10 strengths. So that's another key data point in helping us identify the strengths of the leaders that we work with.
That's very interesting. And I appreciate the explanation on the 50 years of research backing the Clifton Strengths Finder. It's been around for a while and clearly it's held strong.
Thanks again for downloading this episode of Your Life Simplified, which is produced by Mariner Wealth Advisors. And at Mariner Wealth Advisors, we're here to serve as your advocate. We help people chart a course to reach their personal and financial goals so that they can have greater peace of mind that may lead to a more fulfilling life. We do this by always putting our clients first. Because as fiduciaries, we're required to provide guidance that's in the best interest of clients, not in the best interest of a company or shareholders or anyone else. So as you listen to this podcast and have questions about maybe your own financial situation, or would simply like a second opinion, or even you have an idea for a future podcast, please go ahead and email us at podcast@marinerwealthadvisors.com. If you found the information on this podcast valuable, please go ahead and share it with a friend or family member that you think might benefit from this information. And please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. Thanks for listening, and now back to the episode.
Would you mind discussing a little bit? We've identified strengths. How does one utilize their strengths? Should they focus on their strengths and really utilize on putting those to work? Or should they maybe say, hey, I'm weak in these categories or these areas, I should improve on that?
Jack, you have just asked me the $1 million question in coaching. A lot of coaches will focus on weaknesses. Here's what we know from the research. 75% of weaknesses are actually birthed from strengths that are in overuse or underuse. I'll give you an example. One of the 34 strengths on the strength spectrum is harmony.
Mm-hmm.
That's great, right? A leader who knows how to build consensus, build teamwork, collaboration. However, in overuse, harmony can actually move into a weakness because it might be seeking out people pleasing. It might be delaying decisions because it doesn't want to affect or hurt someone's feelings on the team. So that's one of the best examples, and I could come up with many today, we don't have time, of how it's important to focus on strengths, because when our strengths convert to weaknesses and we're aware of what our strengths are, we can learn to regulate those, to dial them up, to dial them down as needed. And the good news is we also have strengths that rescue those strengths that tend to dial up too far or down too far.
That's wonderful. And I really enjoy the background of the process of the strength finding piece of leadership coaching. And so I kind of want to move into a new area where, how does an individual or even an organization know when they're ready for leadership coaching?
We touched on this a little bit earlier, and I talked about, when a leader's in transition, when the environment is in a constant state of change, and also when there are leaders that are being groomed for more aspirational or higher roles. So I would just restate that And coaching is not exclusive to those three scenarios. That's where we see it more often. Maybe it's more important, Jack, at this point to talk about a key mistake that organizations make.
Let's do it.
And what I see sometimes, which is really heartbreaking for me, is when a manager or a leader says, I don't have time to invest in coaching that individual. So they're really saying, I don't want to engage in performance management, which is a key role of a leader and a manager. And so they say, you know what, let's just hire a coach. Well, I won't work in that situation because that's not a good use of the company's resources or the individual's time, because you can give a leader all the tools they need and put them back in a system or an organization that's broken or not working to their advantage, and that system will win every single time. So I'm not going to waste time or money on that. The other example we see is when an individual has underperformed consistently year after year, and they've thrown a lot of different tools and resources at it. And as a last-ditch effort, they say, you know what, let's try coaching. Bad idea. Usually something is so broken or wrong in that situation, it doesn't make sense to invest in coaching. The individual has typically already checked out anyway.
That makes perfect sense. And so when we think about current organizations offering leadership coaching, if we think about the flip side of that, what if your current organization isn't offering leadership coaching, or this isn't something that they're necessarily focused on? How should you approach this on an individual level, or should you even approach this on an individual level to hopefully put some sort of leadership coaching into place?
In the spirit of personal responsibility, if your organization doesn't offer coaching, I think we're still giving ourselves a big advantage if we invest in ourselves. So that's first and foremost, take personal responsibility. And then I just spoke with a COO yesterday in a company of about 250 employees, and she had heard about us from one of our CEO clients. We work with her and her leadership bench, and she's going to sell coaching to her president and her CEO.
That's
we
exciting.
Talked with her through the process. And so if your organization isn't offering coaching, you can learn about it, get different research, statistics, talk to coaches, and then go back and position it and make a pretty compelling case given the ROI. On that note, Jack, I don't think we mentioned this earlier, but a company can expect to get about a 5 to 7 times ROI on the investment dollars that they spend in coaching.
To build off on the ROI a little bit too, I've always kind of been told, I had a mentor early on in my career that said you should always be investing 2% of your annual income back into yourself, whether it's attending seminars or conferences or just enrolling in a different class at a local college. So I've always tried to kind of implement that rule of thumb into my life. Would there be a rule of thumb for you within leadership coaching on how you should be investing in yourself?
I like your 2%. Actually, if you go to someone who's well and favorably known, like a Brian Tracy, he says 3%. And interestingly, when you look at the average that organizations spend on development, it's typically about 3% of their budget. Now, obviously, that can vary depending on how bullish or passionate an organization is around providing development for their people.
And the ROI that you explained to, 3% to have a ROI of 5 or 7% of what you're putting into that, that's pretty good numbers. And I could see where it would pay off in the long term. We've covered a lot of wonderful information here. Would you mind just breaking down kind of the 3 most important takeaways from our discussion that you hope our listeners take with them?
I'm struggling to come up with only 3, but let me just leave you with 3 pearls of wisdom. And I think these tie to the bigger picture of how we view development and how we view coaching in general. One of the godfathers of coaching, his name is Marshall Goldsmith. He wrote several books and has gifted us with a lot of knowledge in the area of coaching. And one of his books is entitled, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. That's my first pearl of wisdom. What got you here will not get you there. At some point, we all need help getting to the next level. So that would be the first pearl. And the second pearl is, if you decide to go down that path, make sure you find an experienced coach, but also one with a proven track record and a strong referral network. There's a lot of different credentials out there, a lot of different certifications. And just because someone has so many initials after their name, it doesn't really speak to that ROI that I referenced earlier. And then thirdly, if you're a top leader or a business owner, recognize the bigger picture of what's happening here. There are 9 million jobs available out there, according to the Department of Labor. Also, they're telling us that in April alone, 1 in 4 workers changed jobs. That trend is expected to continue. And so increasingly, employees are going to be looking for that something extra or that value add from organizations. Guess what's going to fall into that value add bucket?
Let me get one guess. Leadership coaching.
Ding, ding, ding. So coaching and development. Absolutely. So that can be a key differentiator for you as an employer in attracting, engaging, and retaining talent. If you're not a business owner or leader, if you are an employee or someone who's aspiring to grow and become a leader, then look for that with your current employer, making the case that we talked about earlier. Or if you're transitioning into a new role, put that on your question list. Learn about that in the interview process, because it tells you a lot about the company's value that they're placing on human capital, which will continue to be the most important asset that a company has.
That's wonderful. I'm going to go back and listen to the 3 pearls. I have What Got You Here Won't Get You There written down in my notes here, and I'm going to make sure to get that book and read it. So I appreciate the time and all the wonderful information that you provided our listeners. If one of our listeners or an individual is interested to find out more about you or just leadership coaching in general, where can they find you at? Where can they find more resources to learn about leadership coaching?
We have a lot of great information on our website, and it's PerformancePointe. Point has an E on the end because we are the place where performance and excellence meet. So PerformancePointe.com. We're also on LinkedIn under our company, PerformancePointe, and also under me individually as Teresa Carey.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Teresa, for taking the time to join today's episode of Your Life Simplified. As you all heard, feel free to reach out to Teresa or check out their website for more information. I appreciate you taking the time today to listen to this episode of Your Life Simplified. And if you have any thoughts, ideas, questions, or comments regarding the podcast, please reach out to podcast@MarinerWealthAdvisors.com. Thanks for listening.
Mariner Wealth Advisors, MWA, is an SEC-registered investment advisor with its principal place of business in the state of Kansas. Registration of an investment advisor does not imply a certain level of skill or training. MWA is in compliance with the current notice filing requirements imposed upon registered investment advisors by those states in which MWA maintains clients. MWA may only transact business in those states in which it is notice filed or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from notice filing requirements. Any subsequent direct communication by MWA with the prospective client shall be conducted by a representative that is either registered or qualifies for an exemption or exclusion from registration in the state where the prospective client resides. For additional information about MWA, including fees and services, please contact MWA or refer to the Investment Advisor Public Disclosure website, www.advisorinfo.sec.gov. Please read the disclosure statement carefully before you invest or send money. The views expressed in this podcast are for educational purposes only and do not take into account any individual personal, financial, legal, or tax considerations. As such, the information contained herein is not intended to be personal legal, investment, or tax advice. Nothing herein should be relied upon as such, and there is no guarantee that any claims made will come to pass. The opinions are based on information and sources of information deemed to be reliable, but Mariner Wealth Advisors does not warrant the accuracy of the information. The guest today is not affiliated with Mariner Wealth Advisors, and their opinions expressed are their own.